In addition to this, in his analysis of the contemporary modern society or capitalist society, Baudrillard also introduces a third concept of value. Okay. Let me read from here. Henceforth, value is determined by the laws of political economy, henceforth with capitalism, and as the system of political economy expands, the entire world is rationalized and functionalized in accordance with the imperatives of capital accumulation. Thus, abstract values, money, capital, exchange value, rule society, and reduce complex symbolic systems to the nexus of the cash register and its quantitative measures. Within the system of political economy, value is articulated as use value, utility of objects, exchange value, monetary worth, commercial value, and statutory value. Okay? Or what Baudrillard calls as sign value. Okay? So another third conceptualization of value, in addition to use and exchange, what we would have sign value. Actually, this has already been pointed out in earlier works, okay? When the objects began to constitute a system in the consumer society, of course, the arrangement of the objects in the space of consumption establishes a more or less discernible, so to speak, stability among in terms of their relationships with each other. Therefore, out of these relationships, it turned out to be possible to extract another value, a surplus value of the objects, remember that famous structuralist dictum, the value of the sign is the difference of the sign, etc., etc., okay? So out of this, the objects acquire a third kind of value, not only in exchange value, not only in relation to their being in exchange or their being in the consumption process, answering to our needs, for instance, and therefore assuming a utility, therefore use value, or locating themselves in the larger processes of exchange, therefore assuming an exchange value. In addition to this, now locating themselves in the system of objects, in the social distribution of the objects in the space of consumption, they acquire a sign value as well, or statutory value. Status, it's something related with status and prestige. Therefore, the objects are no longer only for consumption, only for meeting our needs, only for exchange, but at the same time we associate with the objects as to show where we are willing to stand or really are standing in the distribution of the social roles. Okay. For instance, branding or brand name, etc., making a brand, all are associated with this sign value of the objects. Okay, wearing this kind of trousers, that kind of shirt, using such brand glasses, etc., etc., cars, all distributing certain prestige and status to the individuals associated with them. Okay. This is as well, I consider as an important contribution brought about by Baudrillard's efforts in sociological analysis. So, when you study the objects circulating in society, you should take into consideration this sign value of the objects as well. Okay. Okay, we talked about the relationship between use value and exchange value. Okay. Two process actually for Baudrillard makes itself apparent. One he associates with theories of Marx, and the other one with Max Weber. Okay, one is the overemphasis in such societies onto production, exemplified by Marxian theory, and the other one is the increasing rationalization. Again, the important point here is that I stress this because I know that you usually tend to associate rationalization with the human thinking. Okay. Now, well, we are no longer in modernity, so rationalization acquires a kind of autonomy in relation to human thinking. Now, this can be seen even in Weberian own thinking at the beginning of the 20th century over there. Okay. For instance, in his famous book, The Spirit of Capitalism, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, the point was this. I don't know if I talked about it earlier in this class, so this may be a repetition perhaps, but it's worth to do it. The point was this. The Protestants, for instance, out of his willing, okay, chooses to act like a Protestant. This was the Weberian argument. But as a result of this acting like a Protestant, there accumulates capital which demands reinvestment. Okay. Now, it appears that the initiating act started by the human will ends up by a social process which enforces to act human beings in accord with its own requirements. Therefore, if you can easily associate what Weber calls value rationality with human free thinking, this concerns the selection of the ends of our actions. Okay, we are the actors. We act within the social, and in this action there are two important components. Okay, the ends of our actions and the means that we use to be able to arrive or realize our ends. Okay, so the ends, however, telos, is prior in our thinking before we act. Okay, so I want to do this, therefore I do this. Okay, so I want to do this, referring to a free capacity of the will on the part of the human agency. Okay, so it is we who want to determine the ends of our action. This is the measure of our freedom as human beings. So value rationality, what he calls value rationality, concerns the problem of the determination of the ends of our actions. Okay, almost completely dependent upon our human free rational willing. Okay, however, this was the way Protestant chooses to act as a Protestant in the world. Okay, now the basic premises was that hardworking, and sparing, or to put it rightfully, refraining from conspicuous consumption, not consuming much which may exceed the need to meet our natural wants. Okay? However, this produces, according to Weber, capitalism through accumulation of wealth. Okay? Which demands on its own part reinvestment. Okay? It is no longer up to you to choose what the capital is going to do. Okay? The capital demands reinvestments. And the only place for movement for human beings is left here in this situation. This situation he calls, as you know, the iron cage, okay, is left for the human being is to respond to these demands. Okay? Now, therefore, this is at the same time the threshold of the passage from the value rationality to instrumental rationality. Okay? Well, instrumental rationality, therefore, operates under the logic of capitalism, if you like, and forces human beings' rationality to delimit itself only to consider the means rather than the ends. Okay? So it means that under capitalism, you no longer are free to choose, to make any choices about the ends of your action. Okay? This is in that sense he calls this situation as the iron cage, and as something threatening the basics of the human freedom. Okay? Here, it is this rationalization in Baudrillard we are talking about, okay? The rationalization brought about by the proliferation of the objects themselves. This rationalization is no longer dependent upon or can be conceived by an analysis of the human rationality any longer, okay? This rationalization already belongs to the organization of the objects, their proliferation, crowding up the social space. Okay? Even though this theme is turned out to be quite important in later Baudrillard's thinking, and he would carry this to its extremes, as we will see. Okay, in the meantime, in this work, it's still in its nuclear form. Okay. So while the earlier societies were based upon symbolic interaction, then the modern society is obsessed or determined by production, okay, which he would later symbolize with the term metallurgical society as well, okay. Now, of course, that enters into a picture the question of the politics, okay? What are we gonna do in such a situation? Let me remind you, even to be able to ask such a question still implies that there is something left in our humanity believing that we are capable of doing something about it, okay? As we will see, when Baudrillard proceeds in the direction of postmodern thinking, this belief in the human capacity will gradually fade away, disappear. Okay? Simply because, as you may understand, posing the question in political terms implies still that, carries that implication that we human beings are responsible for what's going in history, and we human beings are capable of doing something about it. Okay? But as we'll see, postmodernity, when it arrives with all its harshness, upon Baudrillard at least, Baudrillard would no longer be able to see any such possibility at all. So he would completely dismiss the political question. The political question comes into the fore in other thinkers as well. So their thinking were primarily political, don't forget this, okay? When they were criticizing subjectivity and its totalizing effects, they were doing this for political reasons, not simply for academic reasons at all, okay? For instance, to be able to open up a space for differences, different ethnic cultures, different ethnic identities, different sexual identities, etc., etc., you know? The totalizing effect of modernity shows itself in the hegemony of, say, in our sexual life, in the hegemony of the heterosexism, for instance, okay? Or in the hegemony of nationalism to the disadvantage of other ethnic identities and so on and so forth. So they were trying to open up a way for the existence of difference and for the proliferation of the difference. But there come a time that difference turned out to be something quite popular and began to lose a considerable portion of its meaning and effectiveness. Actually, that has been already signaled in Lacanian shift from structuralism to post-structuralism, from sign to signifier, for instance, okay? A signifier which is no longer capable of associating itself with a signified. You know, that this practically means that you are being Kurdish, that you are being homosexual, that you are being this or that, has no interesting meaning at all any longer. Okay? So difference, what we are witnessing here the reduction of the differences. They're being rendered unimportant, which culminate later on, as declared by McLuhan, an American sociologist, culminate in everything solids melting in thin air. Okay? And Baudrillard would talk about this as the implosion of everything discernible in our lives. Okay? Implosion of meanings, implosion of realities, implosion of agencies, whatever you like to point out in early modernity as standing something over there. Okay? Including the object and subject, of course. Okay? So, in the mirror of production, therefore, Baudrillard develops a kind of political project as well, in the hope, showing that he had this still hope at that time. Okay? Linking symbolic exchange with a cultural revolutionary project, actually. Okay. You know, so far we have seen that, for instance, Michel Foucault, while supporting on the one hand all those marginal movements, on the other hand culminating his theoretical position with a return or taking a recourse to the hope of, if you like, reconstitution of the subject on this or that basis. Okay, first, around the concept of the care of the self, proposing care of the self according to certain aesthetic principles, then later on ethical principles. Okay, and we have seen as well that the couple like Deleuze and Guattari, so radical were they, okay, suggesting as a strategy, gradually beginning to forget about any possible social transformation, well, suggesting as an escape, as a reaction, a molecular revolution, okay, in the form of the individual schizophrenic flight from all those encompassing procedures of the capitalist socius. Okay. Now, in a similar fashion, Baudrillard will come up with another strategy, hoping, or kind of nostalgic strategy actually, advocating a return back to the symbolic exchange. Okay. And he had suggested several tactics to be able to arrive at that aim. For instance, one of the interesting subjects already implied in Deleuze and Guattari's writings as well was to go to the extremes of what's going on right now. If they are willing us to consume more, let's consume more. To the point consumption loses its meaning. Okay? Actually, herein lies kind of a Nietzschean logic. Okay, when, you know, in his discussion of the eternal return, when Nietzsche talks about the transformation of one form of will into another, especially in the case of the transformation of negative will into the positive will, he would say that negative will carries its own denial up to such a point that that denial itself turns out to be active. Okay, so for instance, in his analysis of the Christian ascetic as well, shows that Christian ascetic, which is asceticism according to him based upon a self-denial, a serious self-denial, arrives at such a point in his own self-denial that out of that individual self-denial of the ascetic, there comes the new man. Okay. So it's something similar to this. Let's go deeper into this consumption craziness so that we can breach it, or we can bring its collapse and its replacement by a symbol or a new society, which may or perhaps may not be based upon the symbolic exchange once again. Okay. So, yes. And in his later works, where were we? Okay, Symbolic Exchange and That, coming into daylight in 1976. And after 1 year later, or after this work, there comes a very interesting book, a short, tiny little book actually, on the front page of which there stands as title, Forget Foucault, okay? And on the front page. On the back page, there stands as the farewell title, if you like, Forget Baudrillard, okay? So where he develops his criticism, this time he directs his critiques against the so-called postmodern thinkers, which so far can be seen as some kind of ally to Baudrillard's thinking. Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, and Félix Guattari, okay? He begins to criticize them as well, especially in connection with this political project, okay? Telling that actually there is no meaning in trying to overcome the ongoing processes in our contemporary society. Actually, at least partially, I do share that view, okay? We are part of the societies in which we live and we've been formed, so that, yeah, we try something to do within this context, but this context itself offered to us by that society, by that network of social relationships. It almost turns out to be the fact that it's impossible to imagine something which is not related, which is not already produced and offered by this society against which we prepare ourselves to develop a critique, okay? Another important point will come later, okay?
Hocam, asıl bu düşünce kendini toplumun dışına koyan düşünce değil mi?
Why is that?
Çünkü ben bir sosyolog olarak eğer toplumun içindeysem, toplumun ürettiği şeylerden etkileniyorum. Ve dolayısıyla bu şekilde reaksiyon veriyorum. Yani neden ben işte zaten toplumun ürettiği şeylerden başka bir şey yapamayacağım. O yüzden bir şey yapmayayım demek asıl toplumun dışında konumlandırmak.
No. The point is that it doesn't make much difference. For instance, in Deleuze and Guattari's argument was this, okay? Capitalist socius has arrived in its development to an axiomatic stage, which means that it is now capable of accepting anything at all. Okay, so any opposition, any resistance to capitalist procedures actually culminates and ends up in capitalism's adaptation to this. Say, we were talking about ethnicities. Now, capitalism was quite hesitant to accept the legitimate existence of the different minority groups and so on. Now we have developed a critique, okay? Now it accepted this, okay? Now we were Marxists trying to overcome capitalist order. Now it's up to the capitalist order Marxists can survive in this society, and so on and so forth, okay? So capitalist order accepts all these critics. It no longer tries to reject. That was Deleuze and Guattari's argument. It turns out to be capable of containing, including every kind of heterogeneity or opposition against itself, okay? And therefore actually perfecting itself. So resistance, opposition, criticism of capitalism is an effort trying to perfect capitalism itself, okay, in their eyes at least. We do not need to share this view, but at least we should accept that it has a point over there.
Yeah, like social democracy.
For instance, okay, well, at the beginning, capitalists were against, so to speak, the rights of the workers, okay? Nowadays, it's primarily the capitalists who may defend the rights of the workers, okay? It's the Western Europe, the West, who pressurizes this notion of the rights of the workers all over the world, which are capitalists themselves. Huh? What do you say? It is again them who try to defend and propagate environmental rights and so on and so forth. Okay, nobody capitalism is against such demands, etc. These were the older days. Okay, you were talking about when capitalism was as initial states. Okay, Now capitalism readily accepts difference. Huh? You are talking about, say, what was it? Sexual minorities, ethnical minorities, the poor in the society, etc. The rights of the poor, the rights of the workers. No, it's primarily defended, propagated by capitalism itself. What do you say? Any other point of opposition? Just bring them. Just bring them. We are ready to accept them. As long as, of course, they are always marketable, you know. As long as they are marketable, we are going to market them. We are going to sell them. Don't worry about it. Okay? That's the situation, and this is not in my own eyes. Yeah, this has been suggested by Deleuze and Guattari himself. Therefore, they were talking about that individual molecular revolution. Okay? Simply because in their eyes there was no meaning any longer in the social order in trying to overthrow the capitalist society, replace it by this or that society. Bring religion, bring sex, bring whatever you like, okay? Bring art. We are all commodified, and we are not against it, okay? So that is the problem. That is what Baudrillard tries to escape. That what has shown itself, if you like, before the eyes of those intellectuals at the dawn of the 1980s. We have not yet arrived yet to the 21st century. We are still within the frames of the 20th century, and it has shown itself. I say it has shown itself simply because this observation was not done just by one single curious exotic theoretician or something like that. Okay, if you cover the literature of the period, you will find full of discussions, okay, dealing with this problem. Actually, later on, we will begin to talk about the impossibility of politics in our postmodern times. Its meaninglessness, okay? This is what we are discussing, actually, under the new title, social movements, new social movements. What is new social movements? How can differentiate new social movements from the earlier old social movements? By only this factor, they are not effective. Okay? Okay? The other older social movements, say French Revolution, Russian Revolution, etc., overthrowing regimes, establishing new regimes, in other words, building up new worlds, etc. What are you talking about? It doesn't make any difference now to establish a socialist regime, an Islamic regime, or Christian regime, or whatever you like regime, okay? Everything operates under capitalism now. Okay, and capitalism is ready to accept all these, having no fight with any of them. Okay, that's the problem. That's the problem of those thinkers on society and history. And out of this, Baudrillard would arrive, as I said to you, extremes, saying that actually it is at that point, I guess, in the history of Western thinking, conservative and leftist thinking come into a common point. The end of history. Okay. At the other side of the ocean, what was his name? Daniel Bell. Somebody, Fukuyama and others, the conservative sociologists or analysts, were talking about the age of end of history, end of ideology, etc. Okay, and here from the left as well, they were coming to that point. Okay, end of history meaning that, you know, we have prepared the way. Baudrillard would say, okay, it's us. We have destroyed the progressive Hegelian notion of history. We do no longer believe in it. If we do no longer believe in it, as Jameson had already pointed out, you know, what are the meaning of the times we are living in now then? Huh? If these times we find ourselves in have no history and no future, what's the meaning of it then? Okay? Therefore, Jameson was saying that we have been enframed within an infinite, never ceasing present. where the distinction between past, present, and future are no longer valid. Okay, this is the sense we actually sense of my saying that the difference had been reduced. Okay, so being the member of this ethnic group or having that sexual identity or whatever it is you can imagine, meaning nothing any longer. It makes no difference if you are homosexual. It makes no difference if you are Kurdish. It makes no difference if you are somebody from the outer space. It makes no difference if you think this way or that way, okay? But the meaning of thinking in this way or that way comes out of that difference. And that difference matters. That was why people fight each other, killed each other, etc., okay? Now, we are not killing each other, but the differences doesn't matter any longer. Okay? That's the problem with the postmodernity in the eyes of those thinkers. Okay? This implies at the same time in Baudrillard's language the loss of meaning, which had already been explained, brought into the picture by Lacan himself. Okay? We were talking about the proliferation of the signifiers, which themselves are not able to connect with their signifieds, which is barred from their signifieds, if you like. This bar proves to be insurmountable. Therefore, according to Lacan, a signifier can only refer to another signifier, another signifier, another signifier, another signifier in an unceasing process. In the meantime, producing new signifiers at the same time. Okay? So this means that the signifiers themselves or the entities we are still able to discern in our lives does not have any meaning at all. Okay? Their meaning only and only as long as they relate with other things, taking us along the chain. That I have a car with such a brand, that you have that trousers with such a brand, etc. All they're being connected, and Baudrillard's argument was that they are now. They are. They are who decide now what's going to be done. Okay? It is just like the transformation of the value rationality into instrumental rationality. You are no longer in the position of deciding what you are going to do. That's the basic argument. This is the postmodern experience, okay? You have been told, and the strange point was that in modernity, for instance, we were capable of claiming that we've been told by this fucking exploitative bourgeois. We have been exploited by these social group or those men, okay? No, we are not in the position of saying this as well. We have been done this or that, we do not know what and by whom, having no idea at all, okay? Later on, in his later works, in early 1980s, Baudrillard speaks of this as the fatal processes, where he declares that actually the modern problematic of the relationship between subject and object has been reversed. And believe me, if that is true, this is a real catastrophe, simply because it means that human beings do no longer occupy that privileged subject position in relation to that reduced objects, world of objects. Well, on the contrary, okay, now the objects having themselves their own strategies reduced the human into the position of the object, locating themselves into the position of the subject. This is the meaning of the fatal processes, and a sociologist taking a serious look at the society, for a sociologist doing this would not be easy to deny. So, okay, think about all those social processes which control us rather than being controlled by our own selves. Think about the processes of politics, think about processes of economic production, think about process of even such an occupation like press, journalism, etc. Okay, it's no longer up to the individual human journalist to decide what journalism means and how it should operate. Okay, there are established processes and procedures enforcing each and every new candidate journalist to act in definite ways. Okay, forget about good old days of press that a journalist enters into the occupation just to inform the public about the truth, but only the truth. Okay, if you are carrying this dream as individual on your own self, just enter into that media processes and see how it goes. Okay. Yeah, I know that this is not good news, and we do not like to take it seriously, but as sociologists, we cannot close our eyes to what's really going on and how powerful those processes turn out to be in controlling our lives. Okay, that was the point Baudrillard bringing in a rather sloganious, so to speak, fashion to our attention in early 1980s. Okay. For instance, he was talking about simulation and simulacra, implying that our world now began to be crowded by simulations rather than real entities, real experiences. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origins or reality, a hyperreal. By this, what he implies is this, okay, every one of us, okay, acts as if we are imitating an ideal model, an ideal love, an ideal human being, an ideal intellectual, an ideal woman, an ideal housewife, an ideal husband, etc., etc., okay? And we evaluate our real social life by comparing everything with these ideals. An ideal house, middle-class house, an ideal university, etc. And forgetting about the real experience actually in the meantime, okay? That was why he's gonna say that hyper-reality, which is groundless and based upon simply upon the codes and the models, okay? This hyper-reality turned out to be more real in our lives, okay, than the reality itself. And he also would say that through this processes of implosion, everything imploding meaning exploding towards inside, okay? Therefore, not expanding, but shrinking down, okay? So he identifies, for instance, modern society obsessed with production, that metallurgical society, with the concept of explosion. There he says everything explodes. Production explodes, consumption explodes. Even the territories of the countries do explode, expand. Okay, capitalism exploding, expanding all over the face of the world, etc. But now he says we are in the age of implosions, and these implosions, the collapses of everything that came into being into itself, erasing the boundaries between the things at the same time, and the primary boundary it erases is nothing else than the boundary between the hyperreal or simulacra and the reality. Okay, it simply practically means that we have lost sight of what real is any longer. Okay, we are not capable of making distinctions between real and unreal, if you like. Okay, representations. The earlier term was it. Okay, we are no longer using the term representations simply because the term representation had the merit to refer to something. Okay, now simulacra does not refer to anything. Okay, simulacra refers other simulacra. That's all. Okay. And within this context, of course, what we have seen, these three processes, the proliferation of simulations, the unavoidable processes of implosion, and the covering of the field of experience by hyperreality. Okay, let me read the quotation. Information dissolves meaning and the social into a sort of nebulous state, leading not at all to a surfeit of innovation, but to the very contrary, to total entropy. Okay? So, total entropy, actually this entropy, the state of inertia, so to speak, would necessarily be arrived within such a logic, simply because, you know, we no longer think that history progresses. If history does not progress, how we can say that where we are heading, where we are going? Okay, we exceed our time. There are a few more points that I would like to add, but this can wait for the next session. So communicate among yourselves about these extra sessions, and if you come to any agreement, just inform us.